My name is Steve Roberts. I'm a professor of media and public affairs here at GW. But given our topic today, I should mention that I also was a foreign correspondent for 4 years for the New York Times and in the Eastern Mediterranean, based in Athens. I even spent an entire week as a war correspondent when the Turks invaded Cyprus in 1974. My father announced that I did not raise my boy to be a war correspondent, and I agreed with him. But even the week as a war correspondent apparently was a very good experience for dealing with faculty politics here at GW. So I'm very grateful for that experience. I want to thank a whole bunch of people who helped make this event possible. Of course, this is Human Rights Day, and that's something we all want to celebrate. And as I say, the School of Media and Public Affairs here at GW, where I teach, right upstairs. Several of my students are here who have to take an exam with me this afternoon, and in an outrageous attempt to curry favor with the professor, they've showed up. Also, the Elliott School of International Affairs has been very helpful to us. The Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communications here, and Mark Taplin, who's a Foreign Service officer spending the semester, the year here at GW, has been an enormous help in doing this. And of course, the BBG, the Broadcast Board of Governors, has been also very helpful. And to welcome you and bring the greetings of the BBG, we have Jeff Hirschberg, who is a member of the board, a longtime activist in both foreign issues on the Russian-American Business Council, also now a partner in Kalorama Partners, which is a risk management and consulting firm. And Jeff, for a few words of greeting.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. It's a delight for me to be here on behalf of the Broadcasting Board of Governors today to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. My father raised me to be a rag salesman, although it didn't quite turn out that way. And the Declaration was passed 48-0 with 8 abstentions and 2 absences as a monumental achievement to the horrors of the Holocaust. The Declaration enshrines a wide range of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Article 19 of the Universal Declaration is what we are here to celebrate today, and it is on your screen behind you, and everybody can read it. It's a universal declaration that is not universally observed, not universally respected, and not universally adhered to. It is, in fact, aspirational. And the job of journalists is to foster that aspiration in one way or another. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Broadcasting Board of Governors is an umbrella organization for U.S. government-funded, non-military international broadcasting. It's comprised of 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and the Secretary of State. It broadcasts in 60 languages around the world to 175 million people every week. Each of our broadcasters, the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Sawa, Al Hurra Television, Radio and TV Marti, and Radio Free Asia, are dedicated to the principle encoded in U.S. law that all people deserve the right to freedom of expression, to freedom of information, and opinion. On reporting on world events, our broadcasters and our organizations face the same challenges as the private media does. And you will hear from them today as to what our common challenges are. Just to set the stage for a moment, repressive governments have always ignored Article 19. They employ a broad range of tactics to combat free media, including murder, kidnapping, ransom, arrest and censorship, jamming and intimidation, and controlling distribution by limiting access to traditional distribution channels. According to Freedom House, only 18% of the world's population today enjoy a free press, and that has been declining for the last 6 years. Journalists are often intimidated with violence or threats, and according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 34 journalists have been killed in the performance of their duties so far this year. Sadly, all of the organizations under the BBG umbrella express the same problems as every other journalistic organization. We all have our horror stories, and we all have our parade of horribles. And I'm just going to give you a few examples. And for those of you who want more, there's some handouts that you can take with you at the end of this panel. In China, the government jams VOA and RFA broadcasts, prohibits local stations from airing their news shows, blocks their websites, and periodically harasses listeners. In Azerbaijan, this month, the government there will close down BBC, VOA, and RFERL. In Egypt, today, when we try to hire journalists for our broadcast entities, the government tells them that they will be expelled from the union, which would deprive these journalists of their pensions and future livelihoods as reporters in the country. In Russia, after an incident with one of our reporters, Andrei Babitsky, who did a 70-minute taped interview in Chechnya with Shamil Basayev, the Russian government has closed down VOA and RFERL, taking us from 113 broadcast affiliates in radio and television down to 5. In Turkmenistan, they have put our journalists on television with pictures of our journalists, their families, their children, have put their addresses and telephone numbers and called them not very kind names. In Iraq, as every other journalistic organization, we've had our share of kidnappings, we've had our share of murders, we've had our share of other problems. All in this room agree that media freedom is a pillar in protecting freedom. Media coverage can sound the alarm on human rights violations and make them hard to ignore. Just to give you one example, right now in Zimbabwe, VOA broadcasts in English, Shona, and Ndebele provide updates to their citizens about their cholera epidemic and how to prevent disease. During the March presidential election, VOA, using a text messaging program, circumvented government censors and provided SMS services to over 10,000 subscribers. Darfur, we just recently began broadcasts to that country to share those issues. As media moves to new technologies, and there are plenty of new technologies, the BBG is employing its personnel to meet those challenges. We are using more video streaming, we are doing audio streaming, podcasts, social networking, and SMS. For the U.S. elections, VOA launched a new website which was widely accepted and looked at around the world. We are now offering headlines on microblogging site Twitter and the social networking site Facebook. Unfortunately, with all these new technologies, repressive governments still find ways to block us. And our challenge today is to find a way to work with these new technologies to get the information to the people that need the information so they can make decisions in their own lives. The Committee to Protect Journalists recently reported that online journalists are now jailed more than those in other media. Foreign reporting, as we all know, has been trimmed in the face of budget cuts in the private world. And you'll hear from some of our panelists how steep those cuts have been. And while citizen journalists now fill gaps, at least in our view, they do not alter the need for professional journalists with appropriate filters. In closing, our question here today is how to harness the power of new and old media to overcome challenges that may be intentionally created by those who want to control information, or some inadvertently because of a changing media environment. As long as we can keep finding ways to bring accurate and reliable information to those who are in need of that information, we are indeed preserving the 60-year-old hope of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As President Kennedy told Voice of America employees in 1962, freedom of information is a fundamental human right and the touchstone of all the freedoms to which the United States is consecrated. I'd like to thank our sponsors today, and especially the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communications, for putting this panel together. And I look forward to participating in this program and look forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you.
I'm not going to read the bios. You have them, so I'll just introduce the panel briefly, starting with Loren Jenkins, who's the foreign editor of National Public Radio, also spent many years as a foreign correspondent abroad. Sherry Ricchiardi is senior writer at the American Journalism Review, also a professor at the Indiana University School of Journalism. Patrick Meier is a research fellow at the Harvard Humanitarian Institute. And Bob Dietz, also many years a foreign correspondent, is now the Asia Program Coordinator for the Committee to Protect Journalism. Now, we'll talk among ourselves for a while, but I'm also going to open this up to questions. So please think of some questions. We'll have handheld mics later in the program, and we want to get your views and your questions as well. We're going to start with a basic question. In many ways, more than ever, Americans need information about foreign affairs. National Public Radio, half the time you turn on your radio in the morning, and the lead is what happened to the Nikkei or the FTSE index. Whether the issue is trade, disease, climate, flows of capital. Americans are more impacted than ever by foreign news, and yet, as Jeff said, at exactly that moment, when the need is greatest, the supply is dwindling. As news organizations all over reduce their foreign commitments. Just this week, the bankruptcy of Chicago Tribune Company, which was a stalwart in terms of providing foreign coverage to a major regional newspaper, going into bankruptcy, and you know that the first thing they're going to cut is their foreign bureau. So what I want each of you to take a crack at is, what are the consequences of having these two trajectories, the need for more information greater than ever, and the supply diminishing at the same time? Loren, why don't you start?
Well, I think the consequences is the dumber America. I view journalism as a form of adult education in a democracy, that our role really is to help have a more informed public so they can make the right decisions when they have to make decisions about the society they live in. As you pointed out, we're living in a globalized world today, and what goes on anywhere in the world impacts everyone, everywhere, including in America. And I think not to have the ability, or for Americans to be deprived of the information they need to understand the world they live in, is tragic. I think it's going to make us a really lesser nation. Everything that happens abroad, it's important to us, and we should be, educating the public to the best of our ability to understand that world.
Sherry?
Well, I think the ultimate question is, what's the cost to the public? I agree with Loren, and the critics that I talk to when I'm interviewing for my stories for AJR, the critics say there's a very steep cost. And it reflects what Loren just said, but also the fact that we're moving towards local emphasis overwhelmingly across the country. I asked an editor the other day, what did you do with Mumbai? And he said, we put it on the front page the first day, and then we moved it inside, and now it's a brief. So, the editors themselves are admitting that unless there's a strong local tie, international is not going to make it on the front page or even on a prime inside page. So the cost is very high.
Why do people not understand, the editors you talk to understand what Loren just said, that there actually is more need than ever, more people are affected by international news than ever, and yet they don't think so?
I think they recognize the limits and realities. When I ask them that very question, they will say, but you don't understand what we're up against here. We've had layoffs. Our budgets are slashed. We've got reader surveys showing that our readers want more of a local emphasis in our product. So they fall back on that. And when I give them this argument, they come back to, but you're not walking in our shoes.
Interesting. Patrick, your take.
Well, a couple points, but I'll just stick to one. One aspect of this that I haven't really heard discussed is the issue of translation. because you have these international news companies and so on providing quite an impressive translation service at the end of the day by doing foreign reporting. As these pull out, what is that going to mean in terms of local news and translating local events into languages that we have access to?
Explain, give us an example of what you're talking about.
For example, the post-election violence in Kenya. It was particularly interesting to see citizen journalists come to the fore and start blogging. Kenya has the advantage of having a very vibrant blogosphere, a lot of bloggers who are out in the streets blogging and so on and so forth. They ended up providing more information, a lot of which were also in Swahili. But that wasn't necessarily picked up. And as the international news sort of pull out, are they going to start looking at that? One other point, though, I'd like to say is one of those bloggers who had blogged in Swahili had his one blog entry read out loud by radio, which then covered 98% of Kenya. Again, I don't know exactly what it's going to mean for the role of translation, but it's something I haven't heard about, and it cannot be non-significant, I think.
Good point, Bob.
I think there's two factors at work here on what has actually been a very long-term trend. I ran NBC news bureaus in Seoul and Manila in the mid-'80s, and both those bureaus are gone with no question. The Tokyo Central Asia, the bureau to cover all of Asia, has been scaled back. I wonder if it still exists, frankly. And you're lucky to have one television correspondent in the whole region traveling around picking up local freelance crews. So this is a trend that we've seen for a long time, and it's not unique, and it's been driven by economics, I think. I think what we're seeing right now, though, is a confluence of two more events. One is the growth of online media and people extracting revenue from news gathering organizations, and that's really accelerated. In the mid-'80s, what happened with television networks was that they became incorporated into larger corporations, and television news was mysteriously expected to turn a profit. What we see now is that those profit centers have even moved farther away, and I think with the advent of online access for so many people, that's aggravated the situation. And I'm looking at the Chicago Tribune, going down the drain, and I'm seeing a very, very, very good newspaper that's been hit by an economic crisis that's gone had a much broader effect than just the Tribune. I'm looking at the New York Times selling its own building. I think we're at the point now where we're seeing a critical juncture of a bunch of trends coming together, and I don't see things going very well in terms of
But is there a failure here of the news organizations to educate people about the relevance of foreign news? If you say that people think that, well, only local news sells, and I understand this. I worked at U.S. News for 7 years. We knew that every time we put a foreign story on the cover, the newsstand sales went down. We knew it. Everybody knows that at the networks, the minute you go to a foreign story, people start clicking off. We have devices that can tell us that. But even so, Jeff, is this part of the problem that people have not been educated to the relevance of foreign news to their own lives?
Well, I think that's correct, Steve. At U.S. International Broadcasting, we have a slightly different set of issues. We are prohibited by law by broadcasting to the United States. So if someone wants to get our information, our news and information, we have a worldwide set of foreign correspondents, they actually have to go to our website. And our websites can be read either in English or in their native languages because they're published in both. And they're all very interactive these days, but nonetheless, they'd have to go there. And from a funding standpoint, as long as Congress still continues to fund us and the President agrees to continue to budget us from OMB, we don't experience some of the problems that these other organizations make.
Well, Loren, NPR, we were talking earlier, as many of you know, NPR might be the only news organization in this country whose foreign staff is actually expanding, despite all of the contraction at the Chicago Tribune and so many others. What have you learned about how to portray foreign news, market foreign news, educate your audience that allows you to expand?
Well, what we've learned is that the excuse a lot of major corporations, media corporations, said the public doesn't want international news. We've learned that's bullshit. In fact,
Is that a technical term?
yes.
That's a political science term.
It's a journalist term.
Right.
Basically, we have grown because of our foreign coverage. We now reach close to 30 million people, and it's grown in every survey we've ever done. What is it? Why do you come to NPR? Is we're interested in foreign news. It's one of the top 2 or 3 reasons we've been growing. So I think the fact there is a public out there that wants the news. One might argue that our demographic is a high-end, very educated public, but there's certainly a need for it, and people want it. And the idea that the public doesn't want it, sure, I'm sure there's a lot of people who don't care about foreign news. Sarah Palin doesn't, but is that the America we want?
Loren, do you feel like people have ceded the foreign news coverage to NPR and sort of said, okay, you're doing a great job.
I don't
Our backs are covered on it.
I think the reality is probably, in fact, that's maybe the case. I don't think it was done consciously. It's just, network news started abandoning it as soon as they got corporatized. I mean, I think basically as soon as news was made responsible to the bottom line of stockholders, and companies felt that their biggest concern was not informing the public, but giving back to their stockholders annually, what do you cut? You cut foreign operations. I mean, we run very small, lean bureaus, but you're talking a minimum of $500,000 per correspondent a year to maintain one post, and sometimes it's more. Baghdad, for instance, is 3 times that, to cover that every year. So it's costly. There's no doubt about it. And I think what's changed is, I think in the media environment of 20, 30 years ago, owners of media had a social responsibility. It wasn't about making money only. It was also about, we've got to give something back. We're here to inform. We're here to educate our listeners. And as the money became the main reason to have these operations, they've given that up. I mean, I think network news today is a scandal. I mean, how could someone watching 30 minutes a day on network news know about the world, or even what's happening in America, for God's sakes?
What do you all think? I mean, I understand this. Truth in Labeling, I actually do work for one of those big media corporations occasionally for ABC News. And what appears on my very modest check every month is a picture of Mickey Mouse. Because
that's the problem.
ABC is owned by the Walt Disney Company, and I'm pretty sure every morning when they look, the executives of Disney get up, they don't wonder how good the White House report has been or the London report. They wonder what the stock price is. So it's an important point. But what gets lost here, Sherry? If more and more people are focusing on local, with the exception of NPR and BBG, there's less attention. What are the stories that are being missed?
Well, a lot of the stories that are being missed, I believe, first of all, journalism has always been known as a head-in-the-sand profession. So as globalism was evolving, we weren't doing a very good job of educating the public. And one way I think we could have done that is by localizing international stories and finding international angles to local stories, which we haven't done a very good job of. So what's lost is that connection to the world. There's that disconnect now between, I believe, the readers and viewers in America and what the rest of the world is seeing. We clearly saw that in the last few years, where Americans didn't understand what was going on in the Muslim communities of the world prior to 9/11. 9/11 came as a shock. Why did it come as a shock? We should have been reporting all along about what was happening in those countries, but we weren't, and so it did come as a surprise. So that's what's being lost, is our readiness to deal with what's going on in the world on a regular basis, not just when there's a crisis.
Since this is Human Rights Day, let me ask the two of you, are there particular stories relating to human rights that are being lost, that are not being covered? The economic dimension, the globalization, all very familiar, but talk about the human rights dimension.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, a recent study that we carried out at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative was looking at the pattern of media reporting during the post-election violence again in Kenya, identifying where the mainstream media was reporting about what and when. So we geo-referenced it, we time-stamped it, we played it out on Google Earth, animated it over time, and compared it with citizen journalists, primarily bloggers who were getting their information via SMS through trusted networks. and also another initiative called Ushahidi that basically crowdsources crisis information. Anybody in the street with a mobile phone could SMS human rights abuses that they witnessed and then have that geo-referenced. So we geo-referenced all this data and then color-coded it based on whether it was mainstream, whether it was citizen journalism, or whether it was coming from this crowdsourcing Ushahidi approach. And it was pretty phenomenal because the different blobs of different colors were not overlapping, which is suggesting that, I mean, you could look at it glass half full, half empty. Either the mainstream media is not doing a good job, but I'd rather look at it in a complementary way. Basically, the citizen journalists were covering increasing tensions before the mainstream media was covering anything. The mainstream media needed body counts. But what's important for human rights purposes and prevention are these early warning signs that the citizen journalists were giving.
I very much want to get to the fuller discussion of that whole question of crowdsourcing and whether citizen journalism can fill some of this gap, which, since all of you agree that the economic prospects are not great, at least in the near term. But give me your take about, Bob, since the Committee to Protect Journalists is so focused on this. What gets lost? Is it, I remember Strobe Talbot, former Undersecretary of State, once wrote an article which I quote in my classes. He said, "The blank screen is a license to kill." And he was referring to Tiananmen Square, but it is a much larger, resonant idea. Talk about this from your perspective.
I see that blank screen being filled in more and more. If you're really interested in going beyond what NPR is able to get us out of Baghdad, say, and it's a heroic effort, there's plenty of information out there available. If you're looking at a couple blogs, some in Arabic, some in English, there's listservs that you can put yourself on, and you can get a whole steady stream of information. And as a matter of fact, the problem gets to be that there's a circuit of information, and it's all coming up from underneath. An interesting phenomenon we see in China is that, unlike most people's view of China, the China media universe isn't monolithic, and it's not gray. It's actually quite dynamic, with journalists and adventurous publications pushing the envelope all the time. But what they've taken to doing is harvesting information that comes up from grassroots bulletin board systems and protests that somehow make themselves on the line, and then get aggregated by a blogger or two, and then who bring it to the attention of broader media, people watching China media all over the world, especially from Hong Kong. They pick it up and they publicize it, and then papers in China pick that up and drive that too. So the blank screen is more easily filled these days. What's filling it is not as filtered as what gets through NPR or what used to get through the news desk in New York for NBC when I was trying to ram a Manila story down their throat and having no success. But that whole mechanism of getting there has completely changed. And it is citizen journalism, and it is welling up in a lot of ways. The problem is how to harvest that at this point, and how to make sense of it and make it gel.
I really do want to get to that, but Jeff, you raised a question earlier. You said in your remarks that for all of this yeasty turbulence and crowdsourcing and this wonderfully energetic sphere of citizen journalism, you were saying that there's, from your point of view, there's a professional standard or a professionalism that you think only organized journalism can do. Explain that point.
Yeah, actually I do. I mean, maybe just my personal view, but anybody can say anything they want anywhere in the world. They can pick up anything they want anywhere in the world. There's no filter to it. There's no editorial judgment as to whether or not it makes sense. There's no balance. There's no even-handedness. There's no reporting every side of the story. And if you're going to be professional about this, at least as a journalist, you ought to take all that into consideration. So, and by the way, I don't share the view necessarily that just because all this stuff is welling up and things are changing inside places like China, that access to reliable information is any better, because the Chinese now have the ability to black even pages within websites that they don't want to have out. And they do that. They did that in the Uyghur situation. They've done it in Tibet. They've done it for Myanmar situations. They've done it all over. And a lot of it's done, quite frankly, with American-supplied equipment. So I'm not so, I'm not so thrilled about some of the stuff that goes on myself. But I do think that there's a place for professional journalists, Steve, and I think that it's the discussion that I'd like to see, because I think you folks probably know better than I do, is how you can harness all these new technologies and all these bloggers to actually make sense out of this.
I think that, I just want to add, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. The problem with citizen journalism and blogging, it's great. There's just all this welling up and there's all this stuff, but how do you distill it and how do you know what's true and what isn't? I mean, we're in a profession that everyone lies to us, from our government to other people's governments, to all along the line, and part of what journalism is really about is trying to piece through all the distortions that you get and try and find where within all that mix is the grain of truth in it. And that's the training, and that's what editors are about. That's what media organizations have tried to build up, a way of taking all that mass and sorting it out to be able to prevent something that's accurate or close to accuracy. And you don't have any way of doing that with blogs.
But I see the role of the mainstream media in helping to distinguish between fact and fiction even more relevant as a result, even more relevant in a digital age where we're not going to necessarily be able to know what the source of these blogs are about and so on. I can give you an example. During the Mumbai attack, I was for days looking at Twitter feeds coming in, and I'd see a new event happen that was Twittered, and a lot of maybe a dozen tweets coming out on this event. It took about 2.5 hours before I found that same information validated on CNN. That doesn't mean that if, from a human rights perspective, if I happen to be in a bad place at a bad time, I would still want to know even if it's a rumor, and I can't really identify the truth of it, because at the end of the day, I want to be able to get out of harm's way. So it depends who the audience is, but there's a role for both, and I think
I'm not arguing there's not a role. I'm just saying that before it gets presented to the public and to a large mass, it ought to be verified in any way you can.
Your role is even more important as a result, I think.
Let me ask you, Sherry, from your point of view, do you think that this development of citizen journalism, whether it's on Twitter or blogs or all the other mechanisms, is this filling some of the vacuum you all have described? Particularly when you're talking about human rights violations, but other elements of foreign news as well.
Well, you and I both teach ethics courses, media ethics courses, and we address this certainly in the classroom. Of course, I think it does fill some of the void. You explain it very beautifully, the void that it fills. But at the same time, I believe our basic principles, the principles of the profession, are at risk. We know from surveys that the public already holds us in fairly low disregard, and that we don't have a great deal of credibility. Are we going to lose more of that when we move away from accuracy and fact-based journalism and we move more into the direction of how do we know it's true? We're going to put it out there. CNN now says this hasn't been vetted, so use it at your own risk. I was pretty shocked when I saw that for the first time, a major journalism organization saying, we don't know if this is true or not, but we're going to put it out there. I think that's a fairly dangerous trend.
Since you have, we mentioned earlier, Jeff mentioned the statistic that now close to half of the journalists who are in prison today, if any of you have seen the latest committee report, I think it's 125 journalists, 127 or so in jail as of December. And 45% of them being online journalists. So from that perspective, what's the importance of that? Are more and more of these journalists providing the kind of information Patrick's talking about? Is that why they are more subject to repression?
In a lot of ways, the online journalists that we see are sort of straddle a line of activism, political activism, human rights activists, pro-democracy activists in China particularly, and the role of journalism. So the definition of journalism is getting incredibly stretched. Yes. And frankly, I'm quite old school, And I've had to continually sort of expand my understanding or be pushed to include people that we're putting on.
Teach around here, the kids will push you.
Yeah. No, and I'm aware of it. And the way I finally sold it to myself was that I looked back at Tom Paine and Common Sense. And here was someone arguing a viewpoint, a political viewpoint. At the same time, using journalism, writing, pamphleteering, and pushing those sort of things. And I can see that, say, Hu Jia, human rights activist, AIDS activist, and pro-democracy activist in China, we consider now to be a journalist. Not someone who does particularly what I used to do, what many of us used to do for a living, but still, that's a legitimate way to describe his activity. A lot of these people, again, are people sort of straddling that line, particularly in China.
Does that cause you any pause?
I think a pause only in that I have to race to catch up. That this is the way a lot of these things are going, that we can have mainstream news organizations and we can be out there, these big flagships, sailing the seas of journalism, but there are a lot of people in smaller boats doing the same thing, feeding us information. Whether or not we use it or not is our choice.
But the whole point of your organization is to protect professional journalists who live by certain rules, who provide a certain function, who are protected by certain principles and standards. Do you feel comfortable in stretching that definition to the point where you're now, in effect, protecting political activists, not traditional journalists?
You're talking to a guy who's on the other side of that, or on your side of the argument.
I don't have a side. I'm just raising the question.
On that, yes, I have to be pulled in that direction, in all honesty. And we had a big discussion about Hu Jia specifically. Is this guy a journalist, or he's certainly doing admirable things, and things most of us would subscribe to. But is this journalism? In the end, we said people who use the techniques of journalism, of reporting information, gathering it, putting it in some coherent form, and then presenting it to the public in one way or another. That's journalism in the bottom line. And that's something we have to learn to accept. It's the same as the New York Times correspondent in Greece, going out and gathering information and then putting it there and maybe or maybe not getting in the paper. Yes, I think at this point we have to say yes.
I think that's absolutely spot on. That the line between citizen journalism and digital activists is I don't think there's a line anymore, to be completely honest, because what we're having now is individuals who are able to document what have you, human rights abuses, corruption, and so on, can automatically broadcast, right? With YouTube, we saw this with corruption with the police in Morocco. It's just instantaneous now. So communicating this kind of information, like witness.org does as well, is definitely a form of advocacy and activism, and as a result, that is going to have some kind of pushback. Because in the blogging world, it's not only a matter of being able to speak out and have your voice, but it's also a matter of being heard. That's the bigger problem, actually. But if you talk to some of my colleagues who do this for a living, really, in Africa and in Kenya, the moment you start getting heard by the government, by other organizations and so on, is the moment you're going to start getting targeted. So it's a catch-22.
Loren, as someone who sends correspondents around the world, decides what they're going to cover, do you see an interaction between the kind of twittering or citizen journalism that Patrick was describing at Mumbai, or we saw it with the Burmese crackdown a year or two ago, was another major example of information getting out through the cracks when there were no mainstream journalists in Burma, and yet we learned about a lot of the human rights repression there because some brave people got information out.
Absolutely. I mean,
talk about the relationship, the interaction for someone.
It obviously depends on the sourcing, and to what extent the journalist knows the sourcing. I think anyone in the field, anywhere, certainly Burma was the case, Myanmar, where you took, if you got a blog, you read it, and you tried to figure out who it was and how accurate it was. It was used. Sometimes it was quoted as a blog. Somebody out there sent this message, and we don't necessarily know if we can't verify it, but it's somebody telling us this is what's happening. I mean, it's used. And I think everybody, you know, it also depends on the correspondents, what their generation is. I think the younger correspondents are much more attuned to the new media than an older generation that didn't grow up with it.
As an editor, do you feel that you need to be in touch with these new sources of information to better send your people and allocate your resources?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I spend an awful lot of time, you know, on the internet trying to figure out what's going on around the world. Sometimes it's blogs. I mean, Iraq, some of the best blogging, some of the best reporting that came out of Iraq at one time when it was so impossible for our correspondents to move, was listing some Iraqi black bloggers in neighborhoods we couldn't get to. There was one called Baghdad Burning. It's a fabulous. Actually, we got produced in a book. I never did find her. I tried to talk to her over the internet. I said, you know, could I send my correspondent to interview you? She was fabulous. She never appeared. I still don't know who she is, but it was brilliant stuff, and it just wrote about her neighborhood, what was happening in her neighborhood. And there were marvelous stories, like she went out to buy groceries today at the street vendor, and she could tell by what groceries were there, what products were being sold, what roads were closed, and what was happening in other provinces. And that was, you know, great information.
Sherry, when you talk to your students, teach your students, what do you tell them about this evolving relationship between the new media that Patrick's talking about and an established media like NPR?
I don't tell them anything. I let them discover it for themselves. But proceed.
What do you tell them to look?
Proceed with caution. I agree with Loren. Proceed with caution. You know that if you get the blogs, you've got to make some attempt to see where is it accurate, and if not, we have to tell the reader or listener that it may not be. But there's so much out there now, and we have to be so careful about what we use. I've seen so many examples. McClatchy News has used some wonderful blogs where they've courted people that their reporters in Baghdad and Kabul and other places have gone out and they've gotten them to write about, you know, going to the morgue to identify a dead body of a relative and what that means and how it works and how awful it was. It wasn't a reporter who wrote the blog and her name was not used, but it was wonderful information. But they knew it was credible because on the ground they knew that source. So I think, to me, that's more valuable than just a voice coming out of nowhere saying the same thing that we can't validate in any way.
Let me just add one thing about blogs. You get to know a blogger, and I think you can establish some veracity because things that they've written about before you keep seeing, or eventually you realize they're true, or you learn that you can trust this blogger over that blogger, and someone's giving you some really good factual information. And that, I think, you know, again, it's like talking to sources in journalism. You know, who's lying to you, who isn't, who's got an axe to grind. You try and sort through that. And you can do that with blogging, too. And if you keep going back to a particular blogger that you find interesting and trustful, you can use them more.
Do you ever try to contact them?
I have. I told this woman in Baghdad, I tried, but she never would. She didn't want to be known.
But you tried to.
You know.
Yeah.
I've got to say, definitely being immersed in the blogosphere and so on, what I'm seeing and what I'm actually practicing myself is that the issue of reputation for a blogger is everything.
Yeah.
If a blogger starts to misrepresent, falsify, or what have you, especially a quote activist blogger who's involved in political issues, starts to not report accurately, that readership is going to go down. So it's no longer necessarily somebody being paid to blog, but it's a question of reputation. And I've seen that, and I've seen how careful certain bloggers, colleagues of mine, have been in Kenya during the violence. You know, they would hear a rumor and they would say, right, folks, I've heard about this MP being shot. I don't know whether that's true. I will try my best as quickly as possible to validate or what have you. So reputation is very key. You'll see this amongst Global Voices bloggers as well. It's all about reputation. So the moment you stray.
Is this another version of the self-correcting mechanism of the blogosphere that people in the end acquire reputations either for good or bad, and that they have a vested interest in credibility, and that has the effect of ameliorating some of the concerns about professionalism that people have raised?
Well, I mean, you see this, for example, Wikipedia, right? The Mumbai page for the attacks had been edited about 900 times within the first 21 hours. And I don't know, I mean, I definitely subscribe to Clay Shirky's approach and his thoughts in media, and I think that editing only makes the articles better and more accurate. And I don't think that any one mainstream news outfit could have been editing something like that 900 times over 21 hours, coming from so many different sources, and people translating as well. Again, that translating role comes in. And one of the things that Global Voices does is basically a loose network of bloggers that basically try and emphasize news or pick up on news that doesn't get reported. A lot of what they do, and I met their translators, is a translation service. And I think with the decline of foreign reporting, we are going to see that role being increasingly important, unless otherwise we become even more detached.
Mm-hmm. Bob, what do you want to add?
I just want to make that point about Global Voices, which is really unique and came out of Berkman Center, right? And it's a conglomeration of almost it's too cute, but almost a Wikipedia of foreign reporters reporting regionally. They each has their own editor assigned, and it's become a really valuable way of looking behind what mainstream media is able to cover, and it has this sort of self-correcting, it raises itself ultimately to a relatively high, reliable level, and it's become a genuine source of news.
We're going to turn to questions. I'm going to ask one more question. Then, do we have mics? How are we going to do this? You have mics. Are you just going to circulate? Are people going to line up? Just circulate. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, but think of, and then we'll get to your questions, because I want to ask you this, Jeff, and the rest of you can take a crack at it, and we'll get to the audience. Are we moving toward a totally different model here? You know, one body, someone who's a lot smarter than me described it as we're moving from a vertical to a horizontal model of information. That when you were a correspondent in Asia, when I was a correspondent in Athens, and the way a lot of mainstream media works, it's still professional reporters, which we all agree have a certain role. But we're seeing that, particularly given the loss of finances for that model, are we now seeing a whole different way in which information gets transmitted? And is that something that, talk about the pluses and minuses of that. And I'll give each of you a crack at that, then we'll get to it.
I think the answer to the question is yes. I mean, and since reputation is everything in all of our businesses, the question is, how do you integrate that to make it relevant to the populations that you're trying to reach? And in the United States, with the decline of foreign correspondence and the decline of what we would consider foreign reporting, how do you make that relevant to this population so we don't have a dumber America? I mean, I think that's the challenge ultimately here. And I think everybody who is committed to learning more is trying to find a way to do precisely that within the context of their journalistic missions.
Loren?
Well, I think, yeah, I think absolutely. I think we're in the middle of a communications revolution, and where the old business models, the old, good paper, I still prefer reading it on a paper, but it's going. It's going to disappear.
I see the ink smudges on your fingers.
Yeah, but it's going to disappear, and I think the technology has brought us new ways of transmitting information and spreading it, and I think we're in there. Who knows where it's going to end up? I mean, maybe all newspapers disappear.
But it's not just transmitting information, Loren. It's the origin of the information that's changing too.
Well, not to want to promote NPR, but it's a very interesting, unique business model that you go to the public and say, if you like what you're getting, give us some money so we can do it better. And in a way, it's totally short-circuited the corporate model, which is we have to make money to give stockholders money back. Whatever NPR raises, passing the hat, as tedious as that can be 3 times a year, goes into the product. We don't hand it out to anybody. You don't have to give anyone else their share. So we raise more money because you're doing a better product, the public likes it. You get more money to make a better news organization. And that's what's happened with NPR. How it survives the economic crisis, who knows? Because it really does depend on people having money, loose money that they're prepared to give for their information. But you have the audience paying for what they're getting.
Sherry, what's your take on this movement to a horizontal model and what the implications are?
Well, I think that we're headed in that direction for sure. I think we're pretty much in agreement on that. But I think there's consequences when we talk about a revolution, an information revolution, consequences for the First Amendment. And we have to talk about not only consequences, the First Amendment consequences for the media, but for the public, and what could get lost in this. If we talk about free speech, but will we really have informed speech the way we have always had it? Will the discourse be as rich? Will the mix be as good when we have fewer voices coming from the mainstream media and more coming from citizen journalists who may or may not honor the principles that we hold so dear, like accuracy and fairness?
But as Patrick was describing, we are seeing a proliferation of new sources and new voices. Your concern is the standards by which they are.
How do we sift through it and come up with the same way we always have? When I was a reporter, I knew who my best sources were, and I knew who my sketchy sources were, and you might or might not believe them. And that's what I hear you saying, Patrick, that there are some solid bloggers out there who we can trust. So it's going to be our job to create those new, networks of sources that some of us are just beginning to think about seriously.
Patrick?
I think that's a great question, and a lot of us, I think, in the media communications world or interested in that have read Manufacturing Consent, right? The political economy of the mass media. I'd love to see a new book along those lines because the political economy of the mass media is changing, just as Loren was also suggesting. The reporting was going where the money was going. Now you have citizen journalists who blog because they feel they want to or they have a duty and so on and so forth. How is the political economy of the mass media now changing, and what is the political economy of alternative media looking like, and can we start thinking about these issues? In terms of the broader picture, I think that the information revolution, sort of capital I, information revolution, has had obviously a huge impact on global media. I think what we're seeing now is something I like to call the I revolution, sort of lowercase I revolution, where it's basically the individual who's being empowered to basically broadcast herself or himself, and then the consequences of that is something I'm very interested in as well.
I can tell you that last night, for the first time, I had a former student of mine who graduated here last year come to my office and tell me she's actually getting paid to be a blogger. I had never had that happen. So clearly,
Who's hiring?
Clearly, the political economy you're talking about is changing. Your take, Bob.
I'm going to verge completely off that path there. And yes, things are becoming horizontalized. I never thought of that. It's quite good. But still, at the lower level of this broader band, you still have the roots going down and people extracting information and gathering information. Increasingly, we're seeing overseas that, especially in dangerous situations, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, that the people going down there aren't the traditional people, the person sent out from New York or Washington, but it's really the local hire who's been contracted on a not very favorable pay basis, frankly, to be the representative to get that information. There are usually several steps or several notches on the information stairway higher than a blogger, but very often they're considered locals with local biases or whatever. Increasingly, what CPJ is seeing is that the fixer, the translator, the stringer, the local hire, even the driver, even just the cameraman is becoming a source of information for news gathering groups. And that if you read carefully,
particularly true in more dangerous environments where the professional or the staff reporter is very limited in her access.
Just can't get out of the building in Baghdad. Or increasingly, we're seeing it people becoming restricted in Kabul. No one dare go into the border areas of Afghanistan or Pakistan anymore, including now increasingly Pakistani journalists. And what we've seen is that this information gathering has been outsourced back down to the grassroots level by mainstream organizations. And we're finding this, it's become quite graphic, this upward movement of bloggers and people posting on bulletin boards sort of coming together with these local stringers and local hires and forming a substrata of information gathering that's become increasingly important to mainstream news gathering organizations.
Filling that space.
Yeah. So yes, it's become horizontalized, but at that lower level of that bar going across, you're seeing more and more reliance upon local sources.
Interesting. Let me turn this over to you all. We welcome your questions. Raise your hand if you got a question. Hope you have some. And someone will come with a microphone. And if you don't mind telling us who you are when you ask the question so we know.
Imran Siddiqui, Voice of America, Urdu TV. It's a pleasure to be here among such distinguished people in this conversation. The question is, I understand that there's a need to verify blogs when we write on the blogs, but how do you verify a still shot or a video clip? If you remember, there was a there's a controversy with reference to somebody taking a shot during the Lebanon bombing, and the photojournalist who took the shot, he added smoke to it, and Associated Press made a fool out of themselves. So should we verify a video clip, a video shot, or should we just run with it? Thank you.
It's an interesting question. I think it was Reuters rather than AP in that particular. It was Reuters, and there was for those of you who don't.
I'm sorry, it was Reuters.
It's someone who don't understand that reference. I actually use that example in my ethics class, where using Photoshop, these wonderful new technologies can also be abused. As an editor, Loren, what kind of verification process do you go through when you don't use images on the radio?
I don't have that problem. Although we're doing them online, we have online editors now who are putting photos on. I think it's a big issue. How do you verify it? I mean, you could how do you verify anything? You get a lot of misinformation in this business. A lot of people tell you things that aren't true, either intentionally or because they don't even know what they're talking about, or they're misrepresented. And I think it's the same with a photograph. And I guess you have to really check your source, and can you trust that particular person or not? It boils down, an awful lot of journalism boils down to your gut about, do I trust this person or not? Can I trust what they're telling me? And that's part of what journalism is all about, sifting through a lot of, I won't use the word again, but distortions or partial information. And I think it's with photos and video, it's the same thing.
That's right. The
network should not be running with that shot. They should stop and go through the verification. That means the network should not be running with the shots. Because
if they have questions about it, no, they shouldn't. I mean, what we present to the public should be our best belief that this is fact, this is accurate. That's what mainstream media tries to achieve. I mean, that's our goal. And if you don't believe that's true, you shouldn't run with it. Or if you have any question about the information, you shouldn't put it out there.
Sherry, you wanted to add something, Pat?
I wanted to jump in because I was reporting on this when it happened, and I wrote a piece called Limits of the Parachute, and it was about what happened in July of 2006 in South Lebanon and with the Israelis. And I talked to Reuters and AP after this happened, and of course Reuters was terribly apologetic, and I said, did you pay attention to the fact that this photographer, this freelance photographer, had a dog in the fight? He was Lebanese, he had a definite political view, and they said no, we'd used him before, and they didn't, that didn't occur to them. But he falsified more than one. There were several photos that he doctored. And it was tough. But AP tells me now that they're trying to get a filtering system. Frank, do you know anything more about that you could add to that, because you're a photojournalist? But that AP is trying to devise some kind of filtering system so because they've got people from all over the world sending them images.
Does this become more of a problem when you have the universe that Bob's describing, where more of this space, more of the origins of information are from local hires, local stringers, citizen journalists whose biases or allegiances might influence the kind of information?
Well, that was the point of our story on Limits of the Parachute, of parachuting freelancers in or parachuting journalists in. Nothing substitutes for having people on the ground who are knowledgeable about the culture and the politics and the history, and that's what we've lost to a great extent. In this case, Anthony Shadid from the Washington Post and Mohammed Bazi from Newsday were I think only two American reporters in when all this broke. New York Times got someone in very quickly. But the editors I talked to were flying people in from Asia, Africa, and everywhere else to drop them in for 48 hours.
Yeah.
So,
Not a particularly enlightening form of journalism.
no, and then it leaves you open to what you're talking about.
In the global scheme of things, I think that's an extremely isolated incident. If you think about all the pictures that are being printed in all kinds of media on a daily basis, that is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. I still think that it is more difficult to basically doctor an image than it is to write up a blog and say this happened. So there's a threshold there that people have to sort of cross to be able to do that. Now, going back to the crowdsourcing issue, if you have an organization or a group or an initiative like Witness.org that allows people in the streets to basically take pictures of human rights abuses, just like we saw in Tibet or in Burma and so on, and then you start having 5, 6, 7, 8 different people with different pictures on their cell phones on the same event, that becomes even harder to basically say, oh, no, this is no longer true. So the crowdsourcing, the masses, is not a bad thing. It can serve as a control mechanism to triangulate between what's correct and what's not correct.
Great point.
I think they are, of course, because, we've taken a strong stand. I do a lot of international coverage, and I talk to journalists, and when they get the news back home, it's not used. Their editors really don't want it. We did it. We put the spotlight on Sudan during the time when Colin Powell was calling it, sort of a throwback to Rwanda. And so we were trying to figure out why, and the reasons are always the same. But Loren can tell you, he thinks it's BS.
Let me just give you an example. I before I came to NPR, when I left Washington Post, I actually had a little hiatus. I bought a small-town newspaper, Community, so that there was an interesting economic base. And it was a lousy newspaper. It was mediocre. It was losing money. And I thought, well, how can you make this with very little money? How can you make this better? And very quickly, I figured that I could get the New York Times news service and the Washington Post and LA Times news service and put it in this local newspaper. I could put national news, international, because it was a small paper. You pay because your readership is small. You get it costs $10,000 a year to have the full New York Times service. Also, seeing the top 3 foreign news stories in a small town paper in Colorado. I just don't believe that they want that. They want a choice. And I think it's the responsibility of journalists. There's comics, there's sports, there's foreign news, there's national news, there's trivia. That's what the public wants, and everyone takes what they want out of it. But they ought to have that choice.
Let's try to get some more questions. Go ahead.
Dealing with trying to convince editors, it's preaching to the choir usually, to the people who are there. We put together Friends at War project in Washington, D.C. I worked with them to put together a Freedom Forum held it 4 years ago. We invited foreign editors from all over the country to come to Washington. We paid some of the expenses. It was very hard to get them to come, and I worked that for a long time. They just said, 1, we don't have time, 2, we're closing our bureaus, 3, our top editors don't want it anymore. It was very sad. That was about 4 years ago now.
So, our market research for the PBG, we don't do programming. We don't do anything on our websites. We don't publish things, or at least we try to do the market research to find out what our targeted audiences want to hear, want to see, and want to learn. Now, I assume that the same thing is going on with publications in the United States. The newspapers, the networks, the cable TV operations are doing the same sort of market research. Then again, that might be a mistake on their part. Maybe they're not. But if they're not, it seems to me that there's got to be a reasonable response as to what their publics that they're serving want to read.
But there's, fair enough, and you've all made the point that foreign news would appear, at least to some audiences, not as popular. Loren obviously disagrees, but as you pointed out, you also have a particularly selective audience. But it seems to me that there's also a dimension for education here. The receptivity, it's part of the answer to your question, the receptivity to foreign news is not a given that is necessarily set for all time. And one of the things that I think that one of the holes here is the ability or the impulse of idea about a lot of the issues related to the environment or climate change, how they are, or ocean pollution, or issues of that kind. So I think part of the answer is that it's not just to say, well, they're not interested. Part of the trick is to say, this is why you should be interested in terms of how you package the information.
We do a project where we have students look at where they have to localize an international story, and they have like 2 weeks to do it. They do brilliant work. They come in with fascinating topics, sometimes about human rights, sometimes about climate change, sometimes about trade. And it's wonderful, and it's all the light bulbs go on, and we send it to the Indianapolis Star and say, look what you could be doing.
I'm not in charge of the microphones here. Who's got the microphone?
Popular bloggers, Kenyan, during the post-election violence again, was getting 70,000 hits a day on her website. This is a blogger, and she had access to a lot of information, not all of which, by the way, she put.
I think we're in a situation in which that definition is being debated every day, and it's a very dynamic situation. People held up their cell phone and Lhasa and shipped it up to CNN should be considered a journalist. And the person who goes to the fire gathers the information, interviews the weather for the weather on the fire, and she finds out what the bomb. That's a journalist. The person out there who happens to be around when something happens and moves it forward with very often little there's I think that person has an incredibly valuable role and it has to be protected as well. And so I enjoyed holding up my camera, and I'm going to hold up my camera more and actually look for places to hold up my camera. That's when you get to actually get the journal.
I think also, Abby, that one of Abby's former students, Loren, inviting and encouraging citizen journalist contributions. Now that's just, they did that, they set that up this week. And many mainstream, Reuters is another very good example. A lot of CNN is another example. Mainstream organizations are now encouraging this kind of contribution. So one of the things we're seeing is a coming together.
Correspondents are sending you what's on the wires, what do you know, and you make judgments. Again, as I said, they're judgments. There's a certain amount of time you have airtime to get stories on. You prioritize. You try and get the big stories, the most important stories on, and then you do the health stories too. I mean, you want breaking news and you want features and anything and everything. It's a matter of choices all the time.
But that's what part of what you're referring to. Readers might not understand the value of having a wider range of choices. Right. They might say, well, we've got AP or New York Times, why do we need something else?
But let me
what
address
gets lost is the richness of diversity of stories that an NPR, because they have 18 bureaus, has the luxury of providing something other than the normal story. Go ahead.
Let me get one more lick in at the American media. What you're saying about AP is available to everybody. New York Times is available to any newspaper that wants to run it. It's a matter of a choice in saying, I'm going to give this to my audience. I think it's important. It should be there. You travel around the country, as I do. It's appalling how bad the newspapers are in this country. If you're not talking about the top 10 papers in this country, mostly on the East Coast, a couple, Chicago had a good one until it went bankrupt. There's very little. I mean, you go to small town, you go to capitals, state capitals, and it's trash, frankly. I mean, it's just appalling. And that's the owners. I don't know what they think sometimes, because they could all put a foreign news story on the front page, and some won't even have foreign stories at all. And it's a matter of just having AP. I mean, it doesn't cost them anything.
But are we really, one of the ways in which the model is changing is that if local newspapers are going to survive, they're going to survive by providing local news. But the web provides an infinite number of other choices. You don't have to have the story in the Wichita paper on Mumbai because that person in Wichita has other options.
Well, and that's why a lot of these editors I've been talking to say they're dropping AP. They've given their 2-year notice. Some of them already have dropped it. But one of them said, I'm paying $125,000 in a medium-sized paper. I can hire 3 young college graduates for that to do local news, and then they're now doing the information sharing in Ohio, New Hampshire, Maine, and Dallas Morning News is now working with the Fort Worth paper. So, they're saying, just reflecting what you said, that they can, if the readers and viewers want it, they can get it off the internet. We have to do what we do best. That's local. And they're dropping AP. Will they really drop AP, or is this a ploy to get AP to reduce their costs? We don't know yet, but the editors I'm talking to, just in the last few days, across the board, were either dropping AP or cutting back. So I don't know where that trend will go.
I have a quick question, actually. Maybe someone in the audience could take a stab at it. But if this trend towards hyper-local news was happening in places like Africa, so Kenyan newspapers in South Africa and so on, isn't somebody's local news somebody else's foreign news? In the sense that if we have that trend happening in developing countries, then we are getting better local news, which for us will become better foreign news. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
We're actually almost out of time. I want to give a chance for one or two more quick questions, particularly if you can get a student to.
These guys actually, work that side of the street more, but I have to say, I was 32 years old, a social worker in Philadelphia, when I realized I was 32 years old and a social worker in Philadelphia, and borrowed $15,000 from my mom and dad and my girlfriend's mom and dad, and moved to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and started becoming a freelance journalist in a place that no one in my family had ever heard of before. I think the answer here, and this is an answer that Edie Lederer gives too from the AP, I think the answer here is that if you really want to work overseas, that you borrow $15,000 from your parents, and go to some place where there are very few other people doing the job. And the country I pick on these days is Laos, where there's hardly anything going on. And you say, my God, why would I go there? Well, the fact is that there's no one there. And if you start to report and you pick up a few strings, and AP is, last I heard, AP was ready to pay someone $10,000 a year to live in Laos and report for them and string for them. And do the BBC and shoot some stills and run a blog and generate interest in Laos. You can start to roll something forward and build a name for yourself and build some credibility. Then it's a question of luck. It's a question of how hard you're ready to work, how hard you're ready to screw up your life, because forget about any relationships you might bring along. But you'll find yourself deeply involved and engrossed in something. Whether it pans out into a international journalist's career, or whether it pans out into just the most engaging, engrossing period of your life, depends on so many factors. It's hard to determine. That's my 25 cents, and here come a couple $1.50 answers.
Or alternatively, you can apply to Voice of America or Radio Free Asia, and we'll see what we can do for you.
And of course, the other factor is, that there's good news as well as bad news here, because the technology has provided so many outlets. When I was a New York Times foreign correspondent, there were half a dozen ways in which you could transmit information from Greece. Now there are half a hundred. So this is well-taken advice that there are many ways in which an ordinary citizen can have access to the worldwide media universe through new technology. So in some ways, it's easier to break in than ever because of the new technology.
It's easier to
but
break in.
It's harder to afford to live.
Yeah, it's harder to make a living, but it's easier to break in. I mean, you can go anywhere and learn and become a journalist.
We got time for one more question. Do we have one more question here?
Yeah, there's one thing.
There's one down here. All right, I'm sorry.
Luis Muñoz, Radio Martí.
In the world, I'm not sure what the number is. I have the number with me. The site's readily available on the numbers are readily available on our website. I think what we find with Cuba is the same sort of tactics that are used in most other countries when they target journalists for jail, and that is trying them not on what they've written or the work they've done so much as charging them with sort of much more general violations of state security, state secrets acts, and these more nebulous security laws rather than any particular violations. The fact that there are still journalists who are trying to work and write in Cuba, and many of them are trying to do it online, I think is an indicator to what I've come to accept is that there's a genetic predisposition for some people just to do journalism at virtually any cost whatsoever. These people are out there, they're doing it, and it doesn't look ready to change in Cuba anytime soon.
It'll have to be the last word. I want to thank the George Washington University. I want to thank the Elliott School, the School of Media and Public Affairs here, and I want to thank the Board of Broadcasting Board of Governors and the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, which I'm also on the board of, and is doing a wonderful job of bringing some of these new subjects to light. I want to thank the panelists, Jeff Hirschberg, and Loren Jenkins, Ricchiardi, Meier, and Dietz. And I want to thank all of you for being here. Human Rights Day is an important event. You've helped raise some very important questions. As those of you who are students and activists at Freedom House and other places will find some of what was said here useful and get back to us. This is an horizontal model. This is not a vertical model. I learn from my students every day. And I hope this will be a continuing conversation with those of you out there and the rest of us.